photo just so that everyone gets the reference. There's a bit of a background to this whole research because it has a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of components to it. And this is sort of a methodological reflection about the whole thing. There's a whole separate clinical part that we can talk about if anyone's interested in. But essentially what I was wondering for past 3 years, there's 3 studies associated with this, is when we put research participants in particularly patients, when we put them, when we measure their brain, when we give them little cognitive tasks to do, what does the thing that we measure in the brain refer to? There's a really serious clinical question behind that. We're doing it because we're trying to personalize TMS treatment for symptoms of affective disorders. So there's this, in psychiatry, there's this idea that all affective disorders are fundamentally disorders of emotion regulation. So hypohedonia, anhedonia, all of that would be just a failure of upregulating emotions. And when we're trying to personalize these treatments, what we do is we measure participants' brain, patients' brains, and then try to identify the neural region where we see disconnectivity, right? So from that very practical standpoint, it's really important that when we, sit our patients in front of these tasks, that these tasks measure more or less what we think we're measuring. So that's the kind of raison d'être for all of this. So in the past 7 years, time flies, we've developed something that in my mind I would call a cognitive anthropology of experimental cognitive psychology. Right, we've started doing this in Urban's lab. Gregor Posch works on that as well. And so essentially the idea is that we're trying to understand how, when we use these psychological tasks, what that does to a participant. What is this kind of subject-environment interaction through which we're now measuring cognitive processes, psychological properties, neural processes, stuff like that. There was this paper in 2019, it was done by Hazel Morrison, that I love, and it's sort of a very large part of my life revolves around what's written in this paper. It's called What is a Psychological Task? And it's a really interesting study. There's a qualitative phenomenological bit, but a large part of this paper, which is in a way more interesting, is a kind of a sociological, historical analysis of this idea of a psychological task. And so way back when, in the 19th century, it was very typical that whenever psychologists did, when they use an experiment where participants had to solve a task, they followed that up with an interview. And then the interviews were then used to create experimental variables, which were subsequently measured. And this is a tradition that went on into the 1920s. So especially in the psychopathological literature from the 1920s, we still see that. And then, of course, behaviorism happened. We all hate behaviorism, and this went out of style. All of that boring story, which is more or less true, maybe not as much as people sometimes think, but let's go with that. The reason why this paper is important is they put forward a concept that they call operational pliability. Operational pliability would refer to a lot of things that we've already mentioned here today in passing. It consists of the actual task that's used, the advertisements for an experiment, the instructions we give to the participants, everything that eventually is going to constitute this distinct event that we would call a psychological experiment, right? And so my main question throughout all of this work is what kind of operational pliability do we need? Where we put patients, in an experimental setting where we're going to be able to measure a neural correlate of something that's genuinely wrong, which can then allow us to design therapy around that. So we've done a bunch of papers, mostly on working memory, which I love. But so there's a couple of sort of, if we collapse everything that we've learned, right? There's a couple of things that we can say about how psychological tasks change a person's experience. The first one is that they constrain what's possible to experience. So what we typically see, if you're going to compare a phenomenological interview, so purely qualitative material, with a similar experience reported on an ecological setting. The ecological setting is going to be much more difficult to analyze. There's going to be a vast variability of stuff that people can experience. And psychological tasks do constrain the experience such that we have like a limited array of phenomena that we have to suddenly care about. The second thing is that experiments typically modify temporal experience. So again, if we compare, page next to page phenomenological reports, in experiments, there's this very pronounced experience of temporality. There's rhythm, there's anticipation, there's always going to be something that's retained from the previous trial, and this is true across a variety of paradigms, right? One thing that's really interesting is that experiments generate novel experiences. So in every study that we've done so far, at least a subset of participants is going to report that, wow, we've now experienced something that's kind of difficult to describe, and we don't recognize this experience from our daily lives. The fourth thing that we can figure out is that the overall experience of the psychological experiment is really, really dependent on the attitude that participants take towards this whole thing, right? Urban before talked about types of subjects. We, for example, found that there are really big differences whether a participant is going to experience the psychological task as a challenge that needs to be conquered, or if this is like a test in high school that's associated with a certain measure of anxiety. And this is stuff that's kind of poorly reflected in the performance measures that we collect, right? So performance accuracy or reaction times. And then the thing that's kind of annoying about doing phenomenology of psychological tasks is typically in papers you have to put this thing, right, which is all of the possible experiences that participants reported on. And these, are huge lists, and a lot of people report on them. So it's kind of difficult to talk about all of this stuff. These are just, one is working memory, the other one is resting state experience, right? So usually when you do this kind of quality work, you end up with an endless list of categories that then begs the question, what do we do with that? My idea was to take some of those salient categories and design like a well-controlled, tight experiment around that. So the first study was, let's first learn what's the experience that we need to account for, right? So I had a very simple emotion processing task. We've included, this is a sort of a clever detail, at the same time as they had to process emotions, they had to solve a working memory task. And this is it's going to become relevant when we get further down the presentation. They did two conditions, emotional engagement and emotional regulation. And then after that, I conducted an interview with them. So we had in total 60 participants, 30 normative participants, 30 patients with affective disorders. And so a couple of things happened. I like complicated little graphs. One of the main things that came out of the study, overwhelmingly, almost all participants reported on this, was that before Urban showed you a couple of images from was it Oasis? The library. Oasis, I think, in my humble personal opinion, is the worst database of images. So there's a couple of libraries of standardized images.
But they did the best research of the validity.
Yeah, no, they replicate well. I'm not saying that they don't. What the participants reported was, so we would have like the dashed line shows the an anticipated, expected phenomenology, and here we have arousal, right? And so we have emotion regulation task, and we have the emotional engagement task. Is that correct? It's wrong. They should be the other way around. So what we would expect is that we show a participant a picture. There's something horrific on the picture. There's a hand with a firecracker that exploded, and there's blood everywhere, and participants are going to experience high level of arousal and negative affect. Right, and then we can measure the brain as this is happening, and we're going to get a lovely little signature of emotion processing. That would be something that we would expect. If we wouldn't expect that as researchers, we wouldn't set up the tasks this way. What actually happens is when you get a sort of an emotional engagement task is that there is first a little bump of arousal. There's this little surprise, maybe shock, when the picture actually comes on screen. And then what participants do is that they construct an emotional experience. They do this in two ways. One of them is that they actively try to empathize with what they're seeing in the image. Specifically, what they do is, before I've mentioned this bloodied hand, they would attend to their hand and they would simulate a physiological sensation in the hand. So that would be one way of constructing an emotional response. And the other one would be something that I call sense-making, that corresponds more or less well to what's called appraisal in psychological literature. I have like nitpicky problems with that, but it's completely philosophical in nature, so we can call it appraisal for the purposes of this talk. So what participants do is they construct a story about what's going on in the image. And these stories tend to be fairly elaborate. So they'll see an image of a car crash. They're going to imagine the ambulance coming to the scene. They're going to imagine a person dying. And then the emotional reaction is in response to that narrative that they construct in their mind. One thing that's worth emphasizing here is that then, when we have the emotion regulation condition, what's problematic is that we would expect there to be an emotional response that participants regulate away. In practice, what happens is that they simply don't construct an emotional response, so nothing happens, right? So that's a bit problematic from the points of view of what we think we're measuring in our research design. So there's some other phenomenological stuff all around, doesn't really matter. Yeah, but sense-making or appraisal is something this is relevant. It happens continuously throughout the trial. So there is this constant interplay of participants looking at the picture, generating a narrative, creating an emotional experience, trying to find corroborating evidence in the image. So there's this constant flow of these three aspects of experience that evolve throughout the trial of a psychological task. So conclusions to kind of recapitulate before we've seen big piles of categories, so we can end on these couple of them. Emotional response during an effective processing task has a specific temporal dynamic. That's trivially true, doesn't matter. The second thing is that static images from standardized libraries are not effectively competent. I know people have issue with the term effective competence. It comes from Kandel, the guy who wrote the big neuroscience textbook. I like it. It means, it refers to an image, a stimulus capacity to elicit a genuine emotional response. So the stimulus is effectively competent, not the experiencing person. It resonates with me, so I'm going to continue using it, deal with it. And then the third conclusion is that the emotional response in these tasks is voluntarily constructed. Right? So these are the three kind of most stable responses that we saw in the interview data. So there's a hypothesis that kind of, lends itself out of this data, is that emotional response during an effective processing task is associated with what we would call phenomenological control. And so here we get to Pete Lush. At Sussex, they've developed something called the phenomenological control scale. It was designed based on an older instrument called the Sussex Waterloo Hypnotic Suggestibility Scale, SWASH. And so they have this whole line of research going back 15 years where essentially what they're saying is demand characteristics work in such a way that research participants intuit what the hypothesis of a given experiment is. And then through this process of phenomenological control, they modify their experience such that it comports with their perceived hypothesis. And this was primarily done on the rubber hand illusion. Do we know what the rubber hand illusion is? Confident nods, yeah. They've eventually expanded that to kind of other sensory domains. So mirror touch synesthesia, vicarious pain. Then a couple of other, ASMR, for instance, What you see on screen is visually evoked auditory response. So the idea is that we have a visual stimulus, the pylon jumping, and then if you hear the crashes as it lands, that would mean that you're higher on phenomenological control. That would be the main idea. Does all of that make sense? So the reason why this hypothesis is relevant in the context of clinical studies is, again, if participants are kind of modulating their experience in accordance to the hypothesis, we don't really get the neural correlates that we need to have if we want to personalize the treatment. So just to remind you why this is relevant. And as soon as we try to validate PCS, we're going to get to some problems. So we have the responses for visually evoked auditory response, super significant. This is how they validated it in German, I believe it was as well. And then there was a Japanese group that validated PCS against measures of schizotypal personality traits. I think this is a problematic one. And it's problematic for a couple of reasons. Do we know what schizotropy is? No nods. So it's a personality disorder that's characterized by very similar constellations of symptoms than schizophrenia. So we have positive and negative schizotypal traits. Negative schizotypal traits would be disorganization, odd speech, eccentric behavior, stuff like that. And then positive schizotypal traits, also known as cognitive perceptual traits, would include magical thinking, which is when I have a thought and I believe that my thought will directly have impact in the world. Suspicion, and not suspicion, superstition would be a version of that. Magical referentiality, where I think people are out to get me. I'm kind of suspicious, always looking behind my shoulder. And then the third schizotypal trait is unusual perception. So people who are prone to seeing faces in the clouds, stuff like that. So the way phenomenological control scale is conceptualized is that it measures top-down control of expectancies, right? And it positively correlating with schizotypal traits is a little bit problematic because referentiality is the only schizotypal trait that can really be cognitively conceptualized as top-down. So phenomenological control scale in our studies had the strongest correlation with unusual perception, which in schizotypy is a predominantly bottom-up phenomenon. It's tied to something called the bottom-up bias, where participants or patients are kind of unable to impose a top-down schema on incoming sensory information. So this was the first effect when I was kind of, started wondering in whether phenomenological control scale measures what Pete Lush says it measures. There's also a really problem. I would like to sort of relate to the commentary from the audience. There's a really problematic thing that they did in a paper that they don't think is problematic. I've confronted them about it. They measured supposedly delusionality within the context of phenomenological control scale, which is measured by how many times you press a key on a computer where the screen doesn't go to the next section. And if you've ever talked to a person who's experiencing delusions, that's a very intimate, very private, very existential phenomenon. And sort of saying that your delusions are related to how many times you press a button on a keyboard after a prompt, I feel is a bit problematic.
So the idea is if you do it many times and nothing happens.
That's how they operationalized delusionality. So I began developing suspicions. So I've invited participants back, from the same participants from the first study where I did interviews in the emotional processing task, and we did PCS with them. We did this measure of supposedly hypnotic suggestibility without referencing hypnosis. And there were three effects, I think, that are relevant to talk about. First of all, there was a strong positive relationship with subjectively reportable arousal on these tasks. So we have both emotional engagement task and emotion regulation task. So both of them have a positive relationship between arousal and the degree of suggestibility. Okay. Now I would like to go to this one. This one is cool, and I would like to spend a couple of moments talking about it. So as I mentioned before, participants largely reported these stimuli from these standardized libraries as affectively incompetent. My phrase, Kandel's phrase that I'm using, not what my participants said. So, I checked whether suggestibility is predictive of affective competence of stimuli, right? So whether the pictures are capable of eliciting a genuine emotional response. Turns out it is. Participants who are higher on phenomenological control are more likely to report that experimental stimulus was sort of emotional before they had to construct an emotion, right? So up until this point, I think Pete, my dear friend, he is genuinely a friend, we disagree on things. He would say that all of this is still evidence that these tasks don't measure genuine emotions. So I also did a bunch of personality questionnaires with them, and there are three statistically significant correlations. Statistically, the phenomenological control is related to extroversion, openness, and self-control as a measure of emotional intelligence. What's really important here?
Or negatively correlated?
Positively.
Positive.
Positively, yeah. There's, I think, a folk psychological expectation that suggestibility is going to correlate positively with agreeableness. Yeah, which is not true. And they've done like really serious studies where they've shown that they're not really correlated. So as a cognitive scientist, we're taught that personality questionnaires kind of suck. So when I saw this, I said, I have to read up on it. And so I found that the big five personality dimensions are actually really cool. So there's a meta trait of openness and extroversion that's called plasticity. There's a researcher, Colin DeYoung, who kind of interprets big five questionnaires in a cybernetic and activist way. And plasticity is supposedly reflects the degree of reward that a person obtains from uncertain situations. So extroversion would be a reward that we get from behavioral uncertainty, or rather, a reward that we get from exploring behaviorally uncertain situations, and then openness would be kind of the reward that we get out of information. So that would be this interpretation of that. And then self-control as a trait of emotional intelligence, I don't know how to describe it in a clever way. It's emotional self-control, what else is there to say? So all of this kind of led me to posit phenomenological control, not necessarily as a measure of suggestion, but as a phenomenological correlate of people handling uncertain situations, right? That's kind of my current working interpretation of what is going on here. Study 2. Because all of this was done qualitatively on a reasonably small sample size, I wanted to kind of verify all of these hypotheses. So I did a second study. So it was an EEG study, and we had a sort of quite a simple cognitive task. There was a fixation point, as always. There was a pre-stimulus cue. The cue could be either no cue or it could be cued, and the cue told participants whether the picture that they're going to see is going to be positive or negative. And the cue was always honest. I didn't do a mismatch negativity experiment. So it was honest with the participant. And then they saw a picture. These are symbolic. They didn't see little cartoons. They saw actual horrific stuff or actually pleasurable stuff. And in the end, they reported on valence, on arousal, and I also added a third little measure of what I call sense-making. So it was a measure of appraisal. So to what level they understood what is going on in the image. So it was a 9-point scale. On the one end, makes no sense. I just saw some colors, some shapes. I don't know what the narrative is about. In the middle, we have, I saw exactly what was on the picture, and then far to the right 9 would be that they've created this really complex, elaborate story in their minds of what's going on. It was a clinical study. I have 45 participants from the normative population, and I also had patients with depression and anxiety, and they all had clinically expressed symptoms of these disorders. And we've measured EEG. Again, I'm not sure. This is going to be emotion regulation, and this is going to be emotional engagement condition. So what we see here is this differential effect. Trait phenomenological control in the emotional engagement condition. So when participants just sit there and see an image and they're instructed to just look at it, don't do anything in your mind, just observe the image. Whereas in the emotion regulation condition, they had to sort of, the strategy that was suggested to them in the instruction was distancing. So specifically, as we talked before about task instructions, they were instructed to imagine the situation such that it's not emotionally impactful. And so in the emotion regulation condition, phenomenological control was not really predictive of of anything, actually, whereas in the engagement condition, there was this really nice relationship, positive relationship with arousal. Pretty pictures of the brain. I had a minor breakdown yesterday, so I played around with colors, to be completely honest. So to just walk you through all of this chaos. In the first one, I'm just looking at the relationship between arousal and valence. And then in the middle, we have the ERPs, event-related potentials in EEG. Blue is patients, green is normative. This box and this box, let's ignore that, because that would be neutral stimulus with high arousal, and I'm not sure I know what that means. So you would see a picture of like a mug on the table, and you would say it's neutral, and then your arousal would be 9. I'm not sure. We need to do follow-up phenomenological studies to explore what that specific experience is like. But so we see exactly what we would imagine seeing. So we see this little tail that goes up in the normative sample and not in the patients with depression. That's something called the late positive potential. And it's this positive going deflection in the EEG that kind of is supposedly what it means is this high level affective processing of the stimuli. And in the emotion regulation condition, we see that there's this sharp upwards direction, especially the upper ones are the negative stimuli. Yeah. So I'm showing you this picture just to kind of reassure you that these tasks actually did measure emotional processing as it is reported in the literature. Let's go to the prettier colors. Okay, sense making. This was the second thing that I was interested in, right? So this phenomenological process whereby emotional response is constructed when you see these little images. And again, we saw so here we have intensity, and we have the degree of sense making. And we see that we have this late positive potential really well expressed. The pink ones are the patients, right? So it's basically the same graph as it was before, where we see that this appraisal process is the thing that kind of carries the brain signal associated with emotional processing. Really cool stuff. And then we have phenomenological control. Purple ones are low phenomenological control. Yellow ones are high phenomenological control. Yes. So I collapsed the patients in the normative sample. Do you see the cool thing? Does anyone notice the cool thing? I'm gonna change it a little bit. So this is the same kind of graph, but what I did was I just collapsed the intensities, and instead of banana splitting the participants, I did it according to quartiles. So what we see is that in participants who are high on phenomenological control, about 200 to 300 milliseconds after we presented them with the image, there is this really, really strong downwards going deflection. There's an N300 component. I know you don't know what this is because N300 is a very rarely investigated component, but I'm very excited about it. N300, what it basically does is it encodes for statistically regular stimuli. So something that would be, that you see it in the visual modality where it follows a regular rhythm, right? So now if you think about the task itself, they always saw a cue. And so this was something that I was kind of expecting would happen, but not in relationship to phenomenological control. I was interested in other stuff. But what we see is that in participants who are high on phenomenological control, the sensitivity to statistical regularities is much, much, much higher, right? So the way I'm interpreting this is not that phenomenological control in the context of an emotion regulation task measures demand characteristic. I think it measures up sensitivity to incoming bottom-up information. Yeah. So how is a raven like a writing desk? I think that in the context of studying emotions, phenomenological control does correspond to a genuine emotional experience, but one that is self-constructed, but not necessarily the consequence of demand characteristics. And so, because I'm currently writing a paper on this, I would welcome challenges so that the paper itself cannot suck. Thank you.
Slides back. I mean, I saw this already, but I still don't really get the cool thing with the N300. Can you just please?
Okay.
Just repeat.
Yeah. So we have participants segregated by quartiles. So up there we have the lower three quartiles on phenomenological control, and down here we have the top quartile who have the highest number of, like the highest whatever.
So the violet is a very high scoring phenomenological control.
That's the only thing in this presentation that's not driven by my synesthesia. That's just the default setting in R. So there's no symbolic value to that being purple. So we have normative population and we have patients, right? And so hereabouts we have the N300 component. So in a typical visual presentation of the stimuli, what we would see is the opposite. We would see a P300, so a positive going wave in the EEG, and that would be interpreted as.
So this is event related.
Yeah. So we would expect, and P300 supposedly correlates with updating in working memory, reallocation of attention, change in salience of stimuli. But here I used a cued task, so what we would expect is this N300 component, which would just mean that the cue that they saw accurately predicted what it's going to be. So there's this is a paradigm that's used a lot in predictive processing stuff. So the magnitude, the amplitude of N300 would respond to the sensitivity to whether or not the stimuli that you saw followed a statistical pattern.
It's actually how much your prior was confirmed.
Yeah.
And in the case of the highest quarter, it wasn't.
Yeah. So you need it's not the absolute amplitude. So the more negative it is, the more confirmed it is. Yeah.
So it was very confirmed.
Yeah, it was very confirmed. But
this is like, I mean, there is obviously a difference, but obviously it goes also for the normative.
Yeah.
Sample.
Yeah. I mean, it goes for both. So yeah.
Okay. And I mean, obviously, it seems to be significant.
The coolest stuff ever. Yeah.
But how do you interpret that?
So I interpret that phenomenological control actually corresponds to. So I'm being very an activist here. So I wouldn't say that if something only happens in your mind and it's not real. What I think phenomenological control measures is the degree of coupling to incoming sensory information, and then you being able to generate an experience out of that.
So if you have if you score high on this phenomenological control, what does that mean?
I think that's going to mean that incoming sensory information changes your experience, right? I have the exact opposite interpretation that Aleš has, who's going to say it's top-down control of expectancies.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly the opposite.
Yeah. And then, right?
Because I guess what normally we would say high phonological control,
Yeah.
you steer your experience according to your prior.
Yeah.
But you think it's the opposite.
Yes. I mean, I think in the sense that people are able to engage within their environment, and then through that engagement, there's a change in experience. And I think when you're doing sensory neuroscience, that might be problematic.
Yeah.
But if you're studying emotions, I think that's a completely normal thing. I mean, aren't emotions by definition?
Okay. Oh, can I just say
Yeah.
this again? I mean, just with other words. So what you would say in an emotional research, you have some image database or something, and you would say that people with high phenomenological control, they actually create actual emotion out
Yes.
of the...
Yes.
I see. And
Yes.
but funnily enough, correct emotion. The
Yeah.
one we expect them to create.
Yeah.
But the others, they are just faking it, or don't create anything.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's going to be the opposite, because if we follow the logic of phenomenological control being associated with demand characteristics.
What would that mean for the suggestibility scales? Well, let's say that somebody could you extrapolate these results to, let's say, to something that was mentioned before?
Well, I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, right? So here I'm studying emotions, and I think emotions have this active component where you voluntarily construct an emotion. So I think the interpretation here would be different than if we looked at a phenomenon where that's not something that you would expect on a theoretical ground.